I'll share with you a couple of things as I get started. First, I think my career in public service has prepared me for the point that I'm at today. I've spent time as an undergraduate in planning. I spent time working in the Planning Commission, and then as a member of the Planning Commission in Lafayette. Shortly thereafter, I spent a little time on higher ed issues working at the university, and then to the Louisiana Surf Commission, where I had an opportunity to work in communities all across this state. So my experience and exposure to our roads and infrastructure was not first with DOTD, it was really working in communities, big communities, small communities all across the state. And so my master's degree in public administration and a PhD in public policy, I think round out what I hope to be the ideal skill set to move this department forward. So with that said, I'd like to talk to you about a few issues. I've learned in my years of public service that when you talk to the press, it doesn't matter what you say, it's really about the questions that they ask that show up in the paper the next day. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes, and then we'll be happy to answer all of the easy questions and some of the hard questions that you might have. The three topics I'd like to discuss today before taking questions include my philosophy and approach to transportation as I assume the role of Secretary, the projects that stand out for me as I help Governor-elect John Bel Edwards put Louisiana first in the area of transportation, and then I'd like to briefly address the Transition Committee report that was released shortly before I started here today, and perhaps you've had an opportunity to review that and may have some questions about that. So those are the topics that I'm going to cover, and then we'll entertain some questions that you may have. First, my approach and philosophy as I assume the role of Secretary. I believe that government should use the public trust and the public resources as fairly and effectively as possible, and as Secretary, that's what I aim to do. I recognize that I, along with the 4,000 plus employees of DOTD, we work for the citizens, and I intend to lead the department in a way that values safety, customer service, innovation, and national best practices. I look forward to being sensitive to the geographic differences of this state, and as I've traveled, we're a very different state from each corner to corner. Not just the issues that might seem to divide us between north and south or the east and west, but I look at it in terms of areas that are urban and rural. And not just areas that are urban and rural, I look at it in terms of areas that might be commercial and industrial versus residential. And I also look at it in terms of the mode of transportation that an individual might choose, whether it's bicycling, whether it's using transit, whether it's hopping on a train. I look at it as an opportunity to provide a service to the citizens. And in doing so, I believe that government and transportation specifically should not be concerned about getting you just from point A to point B. I think transportation should be concerned also about the quality of that transportation experience, the quality of that period of mobility. And so our goal in transportation ought to be to help our individuals and our citizens get the best value out of their property, out of their business, out of their resources, and add to their quality of life. I also believe that our transportation system is integral to and woven throughout our daily lives, not necessarily just in terms of surface transportation. As you see roads that connect us, and they're local roads, they're state roads, they're parish roads, they're private roads. I view transportation in very broad terms, and I see it as a network that connects our daily lives. Everything we own, everything we buy, everything we sell, things that we might assemble, things that we extract from our natural resources, and even those things that are on digital media that we create as they travel through fiber optics that might be in our right-of-way. All of those things, everything that we have, everything that we do, everything that we touch, has interfaced with our transportation system in some form or fashion. My iPhone, my laptop, which you may be using today to record this conversation, it may have come off of a boat at a port. It may have come through some systems at an airport, coming off of a plane, or it moved on a rail or a truck to get to the door. And if you're like my wife, you had several Amazon packages come into the house at the end of the year. So however you choose to get your stuff, it travels on our transportation system. And I think that's something that we sometimes take for granted. If this seamless transportation system is operating efficiently, we get the maximum value of our time and our resources. And when it doesn't operate efficiently, we pay for it in terms of time, money, and frustration. As Secretary of the Department of Transportation, I believe our first obligation and duty is to keep the traveling public safe. And equally important as safety is being good stewards of our current infrastructure. So in a very pointed way, I'd like to say if we fail to maintain our existing infrastructure system, we will be spending precious resources treading water instead of making aggressive strokes to improve our transportation system. If we can't find a way to maintain the wonderful system that we have, and it's not perfect, it's going to be very difficult and very challenging to grow and expand that system. So I do believe that we have an obligation to the citizens, both past, present, and future, to take care of what we've already built. I believe there's a tremendous multimodal opportunity facing Louisiana. We've always said Louisiana is rich with natural assets and resources, and making the multimodal connection translate into economic investment and prosperity, I think, is important. And that means working with economic development. It may mean working with local economic development entities, ports, airports, rail entities, and local government. I also think that being transparent and inclusive is especially important in the planning process. And at the heart of what we do at DOTD is we plan. And we plan for the citizens of this state. We plan for the future of this state. And in doing so, we have to be very open and outward in that planning process. DOTD cannot bear the burden alone of building the world-class transportation infrastructure system that we want. Transportation is interconnected, and we should work collaboratively with people and entities that are interested in moving our system forward. And this will involve parishes, it'll involve municipalities. It'll require a strong partnership with our industry stakeholders, both the contractors, the engineers, the designers, the environmental folks, all of the different advocacy groups that deal with transportation issues. And it'll involve a relationship with chambers of commerce and economic development entities, and of course the private sector. At the end of the day, I want to make certain that we deliver the right project in the most efficient and affordable way that addresses the immediate needs as much as possible for our citizens. Having read research and having studied the issues around transportation, I know the one most frustrating thing for citizens is sitting in traffic. No one likes to sit in traffic, and if you're like me, you try and find an alternate route and probably have a longer trip, but I'm moving in that process, and I'm okay with that. So there may be something as small as a turn lane, or providing real-time information, or building roundabouts, or providing different and alternative modes of transportation and access that will make a difference for you. And I know whenever you talk about transportation, people desperately want to hear about projects. So I've talked a little bit about what I think about transportation, how I hope to lead the department and plan to lead the department. So I want to talk a little bit about actual projects, because as I've traveled Louisiana, everyone thinks that if you're working in the department, you know every road in every community by name. And just for the record, DOTD follows a numbering system for our roads. I may not know every name, but we do travel on most of them. Well, I can go through a list of hundreds of projects around the state of various types, whether it's safety, whether it's a preservation project, whether it's a rail project. I want to talk a little bit about a few that I think you heard Governor-elect John Bell Edwards talk about engaging our federal partners in the short run. And in the short run, these are projects I hope to work on in the very near future to hopefully set the stage for great things to come throughout this administration. Governor Edwards, I'm proud to say, demonstrated an understanding of transportation during his campaign and a commitment to taking the steps necessary to ensure that we have a transportation system that every citizen can be proud of. So the 4 specific projects, in no particular order, that I will be happy and excited to work with the governor to engage our federal partners on are big projects for this area, but you have to get the ball rolling. So one of those projects is providing relief on the I-10 corridor east and west of the bridge here in Baton Rouge. While this is the capital city, we recognize that that corridor is an international corridor. Products that are traveling on that corridor come from California to Florida and make their way through our state. It's very important that we maintain and manage that corridor, not just for Louisiana's purposes, but for the nation's economy. That is the national growth corridor for trucking if you talk to the experts. Another project is an improved interchange at the Interstate I-10 in Loyola in New Orleans as the city builds a massive airport, another $1 billion terminal. it's important for us to provide the largest airport in this region with the most efficient access. And when I say region, I'm talking about the Gulf South. And so folks will travel from all around this area to hopefully fly out of that airport and other airports in this state. But to have a $1 billion infrastructure without the necessary interchange access is challenging for us. And I look forward to working very diligently with Armstrong Airport and our federal partners on that. Another big project is working with the New Orleans, Baton Rouge super region stakeholders and the I-20 corridor stakeholders to get rail on track and get it moving. That's a critical mode of transportation for the future because everyone will tell you you can't build your way out of congestion all the time. We have to provide alternatives for individuals. And so when you look at this super region, there's some steps that we can take. And before I talk any more detail about that, I want to tell you, I want to manage the expectation. Do I think I could build this in the next year, the next 2 years? Absolutely not. But there's some things that we can do to get the planning process moving, to get components of it done, to make it easier to build when the resources are there to make that happen. And not just in that super region, I think rail in the Gulf South. And so you may hear a trend in my comments that our infrastructure is integral to the Gulf South, it's integral to the national economy. So rail is not just important between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, it's important to go across North Louisiana along the I-20 corridor as well. And then another project I think that's important is something that's dear to me that I started on as a student in planning at the University of Louisiana, was working on the I-49 connector in Lafayette. We've done tremendous work as a department, spending millions of dollars connecting Interstate 49 from 20 all the way up to Arkansas. We won't get the full value of that investment that the nation has made, that the state has made, that the bond community has made without finishing I-49 South. And so I look forward to spending the next year and then some helping to get that on track and building constructible projects right now. As I said when Governor Edwards appointed me, we have a huge backlog, $12.7 billion. I believe we can address that backlog. We just can't do it all in 1 year. You can't do it all in one budget cycle. And so I want to manage those expectations again and take small steps, significant steps, getting people moving with infrastructure. So all of those projects that I've talked about, those 4 big projects, those aren't the only things that we can do. I can think about the intersection of 44 and Loosemore. I can think about railroad crossings that need to be replaced and cleared up. I can think about places we need arms and lights and whistles. I can think about the types of projects that provide you real-time information to make the best choices as you travel our system. I can think about our cable barriers. I can think about our rumble strips that have improved the safety statistics here in Louisiana. And most importantly, if there's nothing I can talk about, I can be an advocate and a voice for making Louisiana's transportation system cleaner and neater and more attractive. I can also talk about the bicycle lanes that we've added. I can talk about some of the environmental issues that we've done. I can talk about some of the ports that we've assisted with the Port Priority Program. We could talk about we've talked about rail, we can talk about some of the expansions at some of the airports. So there's various modes of transportation in this state. All of them aren't super big, grisly, billion-dollar projects. Some of them are small, manageable projects. And I look forward to working on that in my administration of the department. So your question ought to be now, how do you expect to pay for these and other projects? And I'm sure that question is going to come, and it's a very good question. And that leads me to the third part of my conversation, and that's talking about the transition document. I've had an opportunity to review that document, perhaps not much sooner than you all have, and I'm pretty impressed with what I've read. So my professional experiences, again, revealed to me, and the data across the country tends to support the idea that there's always a desire to singularly address transportation issues. And Louisiana is no different than the rest of the country as we grapple with how do you fund transportation infrastructure. While I agree there's an opportunity to do that, and there's tremendous synergy and interest around doing that, I'm also smart enough to know that as a part of the executive budget, it would be irresponsible for me to advocate for something that makes the state's budget issues more complicated. And so I think this is an opportunity to do a both and to hopefully work with the governor and the legislature to address those issues. So here are my preliminary takeaways from this report. And as an aside, as I mentioned to you, I have not had an opportunity to visit with the Transition Committee to fully vet out their discussions. I'll be meeting with them on tomorrow to have that. So this is just my first takeaway of what I've read. In there, we realize that there's an increasing need in the state of Louisiana as it comes to transportation infrastructure. And there are diminishing revenues in the state as well. And that's a challenge. We also know that the current conditions are unacceptable in terms of ensuring Louisiana is in fact moving forward in terms of our industrial expansions and our economic growth and our quality of life. And in fact, these conditions are valid and are deemed to be unacceptable. And so it's logical to think that if there's a need out there, there has to be some shared responsibility for fixing the problem. I tell people all the time, if I only worked on the interstate and state roads and resolved all those issues, communities still won't be successful because they have their share of roads that have issues as well. And so working together collaboratively, having a shared effort, a shared work effort to fund transportation regardless of where those projects are, is important to me. We know that the revenue stream that DOTD has been eroded as construction costs have increased. And so these aren't new things to us, but these are things that are being validated by an entity other than our contracting industry, other than our engineering community, other than the department. So this is an outside group that met 5-6 times over the last month or so to look at these issues and vet out all of this information. So I'm excited that someone else is saying the same thing and validating it independently of the department, independently of our industry, independent of perhaps those legislative champions that we've had. We know that the federal government has taken bold steps in terms of putting dollars into infrastructure, and we will have to do some lifting at the state level. And I'm sure we'll get a couple of questions about that, but I'm excited to know that others, other than the Department of Transportation, recognize the benefits of the FAST Act. While we are going to see some additional funds as a result of that, we are going to have an opportunity to compete for $1 billion a year, perhaps, of some of these projects. The most important thing is if you don't have the dollars at the state level to make the match, none of it will come. So we will talk a little bit about that, and I'm happy the committee has recognized that. So for the first time, a group of citizens from across the state spent an ample amount of time doing away with regional approaches to projects. They discussed transportation needs and are proposing a comprehensive transportation approach that does two things for me. One, I think it takes a bold step in minimizing the diversions of the state trust fund dollars. We recognize that the Constitution and the citizens said it's okay to support 4 areas other than just surface transportation with our roads. I remember when I first started at DOTD, we invested in transportation, and we also supported other agencies like the state police. And before the last 6 years, I think, we actually weaned them out completely and invested more transportation-generated dollars in transportation. And today, we're not in that situation. And so this entity has recognized the need to hopefully manage and diminish that in lieu of, or in spite of, or in addition to what the legislature did last session by limiting the amount of dollars that can be used out of the 20% for diversions. The second thing it did was it validated the need for additional revenue. And as we talk about new revenue, it's important to note that DOTD does not receive any general funds from the state. So the rest of our budget, our entire budget, is based on the gas tax, and it's based on federal matching dollars. And that's it. And that 16 cent has not been, it was set 20 plus years ago. And my daughter wasn't born at the time, my son wasn't born, and it hadn't changed 1 penny. And unfortunately, with inflation and erosion of that, it's only worth about 7 cents today in real dollars. And some of those dollars are being used to pay debt service. So this committee, this transition committee, recognized the need for new revenue. And DOTD is not looking to fill a hole with that. I like to say that the only hole we're going to fill with new dollars in transportation is a pothole. The only hole we're going to fill is a pothole, not necessarily to go back and pay for things in other cases that we funded or have not fully funded, but to fund things to go forward so that the citizens get something in return for what it is they're investing in their system. No entity that I'm aware of that has studied the issue of transportation can say with any merit, I think, that business as usual and doing nothing is acceptable. I think it's incumbent upon us as representatives of the people and representatives of this government to present a plan, a comprehensive, well thought out, sustainable plan to address transportation in the near future and in the long term. And to develop this plan, I look forward to following the leadership of Governor Edwards and working with our legislative committees, specifically transportation, and you can't forget about appropriations and ways and means and revenue and fisc, to make a difference for our system. So as I close, I hope that my comments have achieved what I set out to do, and that was really tell you three things: a little bit more about who Shawn Wilson is and how he intends to lead the department, to discuss a few high-profile projects with you, and to briefly address the Transportation Committee report that's out there. And I look forward to working with each and every one of you. And the gentleman who gave me my orientation said to repeat questions, and I said, well, if I don't want to answer that question, I shouldn't just repeat it, right? And he said, that might be a strategy, so I won't do that. So that being said, I open the floor for questions that you might have. My message today is a little bit about my approach to transportation and working with citizens and communities, something that will be engaging, something that will try and get the right projects out at the right time, and in a very collaborative way. The other thing I talked about today had to do with a couple of projects that are important to the state and important to the governor and important to the country, to be quite honest with you. The I-10 corridor here in Baton Rouge, the new interchange on the Interstate 10 in New Orleans or in Jefferson Parish leading to the new terminal being constructed, the idea of rail in Louisiana, not just between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, but along the I-20 corridor as well, and then finishing I-49 south through Lafayette. All of those projects are very unique, very different, and offer value not just to the state, but also to the country once they're all completed.
And what will it take to get those 4 projects moving?
I think it's going to take a real aggressive relationship with our partners in Washington. I also think that we're going to have a conversation among ourselves as citizens and elected officials and representatives of the people in the state of Louisiana to figure out what it is you want out of a transportation system and what it is you're willing to pay to get that out of a transportation system. I've always said, and my grandmother's always told me, you get what you pay for, but you better pay for what you get. And that's what transportation is about. Any new revenue that we get for transportation, the only hole it fills in the budget really is a pothole. It won't be used to go back and address other issues that we have not quite paid for in all cases. What we're going to do is use those dollars to go forward for an infrastructure.
Your reaction to the report issued by the Transition Committee on infrastructure in Louisiana?
Governor Edwards' Transition Committee has issued a pretty well-written report, I think, that addresses a couple of issues. The big takeaways for me out of it is that there's some multimodal opportunities that we should take advantage of, that we should maximize our federal dollars, but more importantly, it speaks to mitigating the diversions in the trust fund to use the dollars that you're paying for transportation infrastructure in transportation, and it speaks to a need for new funding in transportation. Without doing any of those, we won't be able to move forward. So the big takeaways for me is mitigate and minimize the diversions and look for new revenue streams to fund transportation.
What will be the process on new revenue streams?
Well, I think the report also went on to say that the department and the leadership should have a very healthy and robust conversation with decision makers and policymakers to talk about these options. All of the options in their report are good options, but are they good for Louisiana? Are they going to be sustainable over the long haul? Are they going to give us enough money to make the types of impacts and improvements that we want to make? So the first step is having a real healthy conversation. I would be remiss if I didn't say that the department is committed to helping the state stabilize its own budget and to deal with those bigger financial issues. What's good for the department is good for the state. If the state suffers financially, it's going to be very difficult for me to have the department excel financially. So I look forward to working with Governor Edwards and the legislature to put together a real comprehensive, sustainable approach to funding transportation.